Good morning, everybody, and welcome. So Jack is taking us through how we go from zero to having an Arches instance up. We thought we would now give you some examples of how Arches looks like in terms of once you have the Arches instance up, how do you figure out which structure is going to help the community of users that will create the data that goes into an Arches instance, but also the community of users that then on the web will query this databases. So I'm going to give a first, hopefully quick example of how we've done this with our project, which is about mapping Africa's endangered archaeological sites and monuments. And I will start with a little bit of background because basically, as it's already been repeated more than once, Arches is a framework that you can use, but then you can adjust to very different needs of different communities, okay? And so we thought it would be important to situate the work that we're doing within the community that we're working with. So both our project and MAEASaM project that we'll present later are funded by Arcadia, which is a charitable organization that has funded a number of projects that are creating databases of heritage sites across different parts of the world, preferably the global south, as it's called, that are aimed at documenting archaeological sites that are perceived to be endangered, but also aimed at serving a community of heritage practitioners that work in country at the protection of these sites. So the point of departure was a very specific mandate from the funders and also some specific users groups. And so the reason why we're using Arches to start with is that our funders asked us to use Arches. So we weren't necessarily going to be using this if we had started, with a completely open page, but the funders requested that we used Arches. And there is a reason for that. It is an open source platform, is well developed, as you've heard. It is supported by a users community, and it creates like that possibility of having a support. What it helps us doing in our thinking as well is to go away from the highly customized type of database that we may have created if we had worked in different countries independently, and try and create a platform that could be specific enough not to make our stakeholders unhappy of using it, but at the same time general enough so that it could be used in a variety of different African countries in this case, where there are differences in language to start with. And by the way, Arches supports multilingualism through Arches internationalization that also record archaeology very differently and use very different vocabularies to talk about archaeological sites, to indicate different chronologies, and so on and so forth. And as I said, the design is aimed at risk assessment and mitigation tools that then can be run on top of the Arches database. And we have basically worked at taking that empty Arches instance and construct a database that speaks to different national authorities that are in charge of monitoring, obviously, the archaeological sites that are in their country. Okay, we have collaborations, therefore, with a number of academic institutions where our team sits. So part of our team that is developing Arches is here in the UK. Actually, Cambridge is one of our smallest hubs, but we work with a team at the University Cheikh Anta Diop in Senegal. We work with a team that is based at the British Institute in Eastern Africa in Kenya, and another team that is institutionally based at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. And then we collaborate with a number of other institutions and partners in Mali, in Sudan, in Ethiopia, in Kenya, in Tanzania, etc., etc. So the team is very dispersed, and the fact that we're working at developing a database that is web-based really helps us, because the moment Arches is installed and the moment we have put our resource models into Arches, everybody can push data onto Arches from their different locations, okay? One of the issues that we've encountered, by the way, during our phase one of the project from 2020 to 2024 is also that, yes, Arches is open source. Arches is fairly easy to install if you have a group of people that know what they're doing. Arches is not necessarily a low resource infrastructure, okay? So if you don't have a good internet with stability and with enough bandwidth, that once you start putting a certain amount of data into it, it has got some issues. Having said that, the developers are aware of that, and they are trying to design version 8 and successive versions within a new setup that allows for actually the speed of response of the system to be more effective and efficient. We've all complained about this issue. So very quickly, what we did in the first phase of the project is that we constructed our resource models. So basically the databases inside the database, we conceptualized how we wanted this to be. And this is an example of our site resource model that uses a CDOC CRM ontology. What we've done is work from the ground up. We didn't come up with an idealized database of some idealized archaeological sites and monuments. We looked at the existing paper documentation that every national authority is using. We mapped it against each other, and there are a lot of differences. And we came up with a model that was a compromise between differences that there are in these different ways of recording archaeology on a daily basis. Okay. And then we started constructing our vocabularies. And they are wildly different. You know, a cairn in Kenya may be called a tumulus. In Senegal, different type of enclosures look different in different types of Africa. And we have tried to start working at creating a vocabulary that unifies some of the languages and some of the concepts, but at the same time maintains the different ways in which people call things, and they want to keep on calling them. So this is what I was talking about. We went from paper records then to create our resource models. And obviously we've created ways in which we work with our team. So when they have the paper record, they know exactly what should go where in the structure that we have created, okay? So from paper documentation to the record, and obviously a lot of working together and a lot of training together with MAEASaM as well onto how to create the Arches instance, how to populate it. What we've done basically at the beginning of our phase 2 that started in 2024 is that we made sure that we had at least a portion of the data that we're working with, okay, visible to the public. And here very quickly, I wanted to flag another important concept. We are working with national authorities, and we have now digitized a good amount of the records that they had on paper and prepare them mainly in spreadsheets for ingestion into the Arches system, okay? We don't have the authorization yet to make these records public, okay? So yes, Arches is open access, Arches can be accessed from the internet, but you really need to work out the nitty-gritty of what it means for each and every single national authority to put all of their data on the public domain or a part of the data on the public domain. In many of the countries where we operate, there are wars happening, there is a lot of looting, there are a lot of issues in very large territories, and heritage authorities don't always think it's a good idea to actually publish the location of certain sites where people then can go and start looting artifacts, okay? So what we've decided to do, and what I will do, tell me how many minutes I have left, probably 3, is that we have decided to create an Arches instance, what we call MAEASaM demo, which only contains data and information that is already in the public domain, because these are World Heritage sites, tentative list sites, and with permission from certain national authorities, we have uploaded what they call gazetted sites, which have already been published via the Ministry of Culture or the Ministry of Tourism as sites that are of interest. And this is the link to our instance. How did we did this? We conceptualized what we mean by site, which is not straightforward. we collected data, we created the records, and then we uploaded it into Arches for presentation. One thing very quickly, again, we are abstracting, we are conceptualizing, and we are landed with a site problem. Most of the well-edited sites, gazetted sites in an African context are only represented as points, and the majority of the attribute records are still in analog form. So our Arches implementation is also the first time that an analog record has been transformed into a digital record, and there's a lot of thinking that goes into that. So the conceptualization nevertheless allowed us to aggregate into the same record information that comes from legacy, cards, indexes, papers, historical maps, but at the same time integrating work that we're doing using remote sensing to go and verify, for example, sites that were only recorded 50, 60 years ago, and aggregate them into one geometry and sets of attributes. The fantastic thing of Arches is that Arches doesn't work as a GIS. You do not have to separate your data into point, lines, polygons. You can represent the same site with the same ID using different geometries, okay? And you can attach multiple attributes to that record. And that's where actually many of us that were using GIS before see the power of Arches, because it takes us beyond GIS. Then it's limited in the way it does analysis, but in terms of how we can conceptualize a site in a more rounded manner, that's what we do. Then this is how we went for collection. We started from coordinates of just points, aggregated all of this different information, photographs, maps, etc., etc. This is an example of a recently nominated World Archaeological Site in Ethiopia. And what we did then, we had basically to go from analog, how do I get into, yeah, from analog to digital. And a lot of the work that we've done to transform these points into something that had, for example, a polygon footprint, is that we had to take a lot of the paper maps that were available to us, transform them through georeferencing them, locating them into the landscape, and then creating the polygons. So basically, again, this input into Arches also allowed us to transform the sites into richer records, basically, of the same thing by digitizing all of these materials, okay? And this, we're just basically showing that from points you can go into polygons and you can locate them in the landscape. And then this is how then we represent the sites in the, as you can see very simply in Google Earth, when we're doing the production and how they enter into the record. This is an example for the island of Mozambique, another World Heritage Site in Southern Africa, how we did the work and how then the record looks like with the geometry and then the attributes, obviously reflecting the way in which we've constructed not only the resource models, but all the nodes that go into it that contain different type of information. Another example from Tanzania, okay, of another site there. One thing I wanted to finish the presentation with is that once the data is into Arches, okay, it can be queried from the end users via a web interface. And this is how basically the initial report of the records of the sites I've shown to you before are looking like. This is how you query them, and this is how you pull up the information. If you have a minute of time, I would actually ask you, both with our database and the MAEASaM database, to now compare, for example, what Arches does and what type of record you can get out of it, as compared to the newly launched UNESCO Navigator of World Heritage Sites, which is based on an Esri ArcGIS online interface. Obviously, the mandate is different, but it would be interesting to compare and contrast what type of functionality the two different interfaces are, as you are thinking about what tool would I use actually to record my sites, store them, and then use them. Okay, so yeah, this was basically an insight into how we go from what Jack was left with into designing the resource models, basically the empty database, and now we start filling it with information and then making it available for a bigger audience, okay? And I think I'm done with a thank you, obviously, to our team, and as Jack did, a little bit of publicity about the project at the end. In particular, our newsletters, by the way, have gone through time. We are at issue 9 that is launching actually this week, through some of the technical details of what we've done with arches, okay? And so you may want to have a look at them. The one we launch actually, hopefully at the end of this week, is about the arches demo.